صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Most High, created us to worship Him alone, and we need to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the comprehensive meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. Not in one act or the other, or the distorted meaning of what worship is or ibadah in the religion of Islam that many people they adopt. It's the comprehensive meaning. It's the way of the Prophet ﷺ, that all of his life was for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of his life was an act of worship. Whether it's salah, or giving, or taking, or any of our affairs, speaking, anything that a person would say, anything that a person would do, any relationship, we have to observe what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, and to fulfill that, and to stay away from what is haram. This is the comprehensive meaning of matters of ibadah. That's why when we say worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from head to toe, this is a true meaning. How to do that? We need to have the knowledge, and we need to apply that, and we need to have the patience in applying what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. We're still in the worship or the deeds to be done with our own hands, and we ended last time with the statement of the Prophet ﷺ when he said, الْيَدُ الْعُلْيَا خَيْرٌ مِنَ الْيَدِ السُّفْلَى, which means the upper hand is better than the lower hand. So the Prophet ﷺ here is talking about two different types of hands, the upper one and the lower one. And he said ﷺ that the upper one is the one that gives, and the lower one is the one that takes. So that means these are two acts, one to do and one to avoid. We need to know how to give, and we need to know also what is the matter of taking, and how to take, and what is permissible and what is not permissible. This is part of the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Yad al-Ulya, the upper hand. This is the honored one, this is the respected one, and that is to give for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in charity, in spending for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a very important part of our religion. We know that al-infaq, or giving charity, is a very important part of our religion. Many verses in the Qur'an talks about this. Many hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, to the extent of which that this is part of our, or a proof, or an evidence of our iman, of our faith. As the Prophet ﷺ said, as-sadaqatu burhan, which means that as-sadaqah, or charity, is an evidence for whether a person is a true believer or not. Because human beings are greedy by nature. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِنَّهُ لِحُبِّ الْخَيْرِ لَشَدِيدٌ, that indeed the human being, they love al-khayr, and in the explanation of it, meaning the wealth for himself, is shadid, is so much. We love what is good for ourselves, we are greedy by nature. But when it comes to matters of iman, when a person knows that this is something that pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, then a person would give for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the upper hand. Many verses in the Qur'an calling the believers to spend from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provided for them. Verses in the Qur'an that talks about the virtues of spending for the sake of Allah. That the example of that is like a seed of grain, that it's in its socket, and it grows more to 700 times. One reward is multiplied by 10 to 700 times, to many different multiplications. All of that is by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warned us in the Qur'an, الشيطان يعدكم الفقر ويأمركم بالفحشاء والله يعدكم مغفرة منه وفضلا والله واسع عليم. Which means that the shaitan promises us, he promises poverty, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises us the forgiveness from him subhanahu wa ta'ala. الشيطان يعدكم الفقر, that the Prophet, that the shaitan would promise you matters of poverty as a result of whispering to the person not to spend for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, spending for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and fighting for the sake of Allah, spending to help the poor and the needy and those who are afflicted by loans and things like this. This is all great meanings, and this is something that is spread throughout the Qur'an, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordering us to do that. When it comes to our personal level, when a person is ordered to give, sometimes or in most cases where the person is worried about one's future. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the certainty that should be present in the heart of the Muslim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comfort the believers. That if you spend for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it would never diminish any of your wealth that you have. And this is something that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, swearing by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam doesn't need to swear by Allah, but this is just to make it clear that you're talking about something that is opposite to what people might see with their own eyes and understand with their own intellectual abilities. A person have 100, for example, he gives 10, that means what is left is 90. But the Prophet ﷺ would swear by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that on three things, one of which, مَا نَقَصَ مَالُ عَبْدٍ مِّن صَدَقَةٍ, that there is no wealth of a slave would be diminished as a result of sadaqah, as a result of charity. So it's never diminished, it's never decreased. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would bless it for the person, but with the condition that the person is spending for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter, seeking the rewards in the hereafter. And this is the intentions that we have in all of our affairs and all the different acts of worship, not being attached to this world, but to do things only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter. The Prophet ﷺ, when he talked about the best of charities, and when we talk about charities, it's so many hadiths, so many verses on the Qur'an. So we're just mentioning some examples, so that what we're saying, it's something to be done practically, so that we get into the habit of giving for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on a daily basis. The Prophet ﷺ, when he said in the authentic hadith, when he was asked, hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, أَيُّ الصَّدَقَةِ أَعْظَمُ أَجْرًا, which is among the charity is more or the best in rewards, the Prophet ﷺ said, أَنْتَ صَدَّقْ وَأَنْتَ صَحِيحٌ شَحِيحٌ تَخْشَى الْفَقْرَ وَتَأْمَلْ الْغِنَى. Which means when you give charity, when you spend for the sake of Allah, when you are healthy and you are greedy, meaning that you want goodness for yourself, and you fear poverty and you hope for to be rich. When you are in that state and you give for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is the most rewardable charity. Not when a person is about to die and he would say this is to so and so and this is to so and so, and it's already going to be for so and so, as the Prophet ﷺ said, completing the hadith. So the best of the charities is not that you wait till the moment of death and then you say this is for so and so and this is for so and so. The best of the charity is when you are healthy, you're hoping for to gain more money, you love the wealth that you have, and you're having fear of poverty, and you hope for what is to be rich, and you still would give for the sake of Allah. There is more sacrifice in this, that you would sacrifice more, and as a result of that, it's a more of a rewardable act, as the Prophet ﷺ said. When it comes to spending, there is obligatory spending, and there is optional spending, and there is haram spending. The obligatory charity is when a person would spend on his wife, for example, or those who are obligatory for him to spend, his children. This is an obligatory spending, and this is the most rewardable type of a charity. And this is something that the Prophet ﷺ said about the person, إِذَا أَنْفَقَ عَلَى أَهْلِهِ نَفَقَةً وَهُوَ يَحْتَسِبُهَا كَانَتْ لَهُ صَدَقَةً. That if a man spend anything of his spending on his family, وَهُوَ يَحْتَسِبُهَا, and he's seeking rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a very important condition, because most of the time husbands would spend on their families, but how many people are seeking rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when they spend? So if they are seeking rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone in the hereafter, this will be a charity for the person. Bringing anything for the household, spending on the children, clothing, food, whatever, on the wife, her clothing, things like that, with the condition that a person would seek rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a charity to the extent of which a man, if he would put a morsel of food in the mouth of his wife, this is a charity. So this is the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is the most of the rewards. Why? Because obligations comes first, and the rewards of the obligations are far more than the rewards of what is optional. Some people, they consider when they give charity to the poor and the needy, this is more rewardable than giving or buying something for one's family, since they have to do this anyway. No, doing something to the family is more rewardable because this is an obligation. But to be done accordingly, not with excessiveness, or not to buy haram and so on. And to give charity in a recommended way to the poor and the needy. There's an obligatory way also when it comes to matters of the zakah. Learning the rulings of the zakah, so the person would spend for the sake of Allah which is a mandatory portion of one's wealth as far as the zakat or the obligatory charity. Optional charity given to the poor, the needy, hospitals, orphanage, anything means of continuous charity, knowledge that is being spread, which is something that is needed so much, especially nowadays when people are in need to know the religion of Islam. This is a very beautiful way of da'wah and calling others to know the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to spend from one's wealth to support any form of propagating the deen of Islam, whether it's on media means or things that is written or books or whatever there is. This is definitely all different ways and means to spread the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, building the masajid, the houses of Allah, and so on. So many different means and a person would spend for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is basically the upper hand. And there is something that is haram for a person to spend, buying something that is not permissible, buying intoxications, dealing with riba, usury. A person would use his hand to put his wealth in a usury bank, for example, to earn, to buy and sell in a haram way, in a non-permissible way, to deceive others, and things like that. This is all definitely not permissible. And the most successful person is the one that when he dies, his own sins dies with him. If he's not, of course, repented to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is definitely what is needed. And what's our job on the face of earth is to make sure that we die in the state of repentance. But some people, they die and their sins will continuously be increasing after he die. He buys something for the household that is haram for them to use, right? And the person dies and the people or the children or the family, they are continuously using it in a haram way. The person is responsible. The same way that we have a continuous charity, there's a continuous sins that people would incur upon themselves as a result of spending in haram ways, and not to spend in matters of goodness and so on. So this is the upper hand. The lower hand is something that we will discuss inshallah ta'ala if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us life next time, how to avoid that. But what is it? We'll discuss it inshallah ta'ala next time when we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among those who fulfill the purpose of their life in the perfect way, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from head to toe. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
قل إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين. قل إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي